Stanford University sits on 8,180 acres of California land and holds a $37 billion endowment. It is the most powerful address in American education, and it exists because a 15-year-old boy died in a hotel room in Florence, and two people had $40 million and nowhere to put their grief. Leland Stanford spent somewhere between $20 and $40 million building this university. Harvard's entire endowment at the time was roughly $2 million. He spent that gap on a memorial. The boy the university honors spent less than a day on the land it stands on. While Jane Stanford was still burying her son, the U.S. government moved to seize everything: the campus, the farms, the railroad fortune. Years after Leland Sr. died, someone put something in Jane Stanford's water. The case was closed in 48 hours. It shouldn't have been. This is not a story about a university. It is a story about what grief does when it has $40 million and nowhere to go. Jane carried a photograph of him for the rest of her life. Leland Stanford was born in 1824 in Watervliet, New York, just outside Albany, the eighth child of a family that ran a tavern on the main road. Eighth of eight, the kind of position in a family where you learn early that the resources are already spoken for. His father kept the place running on foot traffic and seasonal labor. Stanford grew up watching his father negotiate, keep accounts, manage men who were passing through on their way to somewhere else. He absorbed the logic of the transaction before he understood it. He trained as a lawyer, passed the bar, moved west to Wisconsin, and opened a practice. Then, in the early 1850s, fire took the office. The books, the files, the furniture, everything. He was left with nothing but the law he'd memorized and a country that was, at that exact moment, going insane over gold. His brothers had gone to California. He followed in 1852, not to mine, to sell groceries. This distinction mattered more than it sounds. The men who went to California to find gold mostly came back empty. The men who went to sell things to the men looking for gold often came back wealthy. Stanford understood this arithmetic before he left Wisconsin. He wasn't going to dig in the dirt for someone else's payoff. He opened a store in Sacramento. Dry goods, provisions, mining supplies. The store was modest. A single-room operation on a street full of men in muddy boots who needed flour, rope, and lamp oil, and would pay whatever he charged because there was no one else. He kept a detailed accounting ledger and updated it by hand each night. Every transaction, every debt, every credit. Sacramento in the 1850s was not a city with reliable banks or courts or any of the mechanisms that normally keep money honest. Stanford's ledger was the mechanism. He knew exactly what he had. By 1856, he was in Republican politics, which in California in the 1850s meant something specific: anti-slavery, pro-union, and aligned with the federal government. At a moment when the federal government was handing out enormous favors to anyone who could help build the American West. Stanford ran for governor of California in 1859 and lost. He ran again in 1861 and won. He was 37 years old. He had arrived in California with almost nothing. He had, in 9 years, built a grocery business, a political identity, and a set of relationships with the men who were about to reshape the continent. The grocery store was already a memory. The men he was about to go into business with would make the grocery store look like a lemonade stand. The four men had a plan, and the plan was the railroad. In 1863, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad. Stanford was the political face, the governor, the man whose name appeared on documents that needed to impress Washington. Huntington was the lobbyist, the fixer, the man who understood that the real railroad was built in committee rooms in D.C. before a single rail was laid in California. Hopkins kept the books with a precision that reportedly made even Stanford's old ledger look casual. Crocker ran the construction. The actual dirt, the actual dynamite, the actual men. The federal government wanted a transcontinental railroad. It wanted one badly enough to offer something extraordinary: land grants and cash bonds for every mile of track completed. The terms varied by terrain, roughly $24,000 per mile across flat ground, up to $48,000 per mile through the mountains, and land, approximately 9 million acres of federal land, handed to private investors in exchange for a railroad that would bind California to the Union. This was the mechanism. Not mining, not groceries. The federal government itself was the business model. To build it, the Central Pacific brought in workers who would accept wages that white American laborers wouldn't. Somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Chinese immigrants laid most of the Western line. They were paid $26 to $35 a month. White workers doing equivalent labor earned more and were given room and board besides. The Chinese workers provided their own food and slept in camps they built themselves. They drilled through the Sierra Nevada using hand tools and black powder. They lowered themselves in wicker baskets over cliff faces to place explosive charges. The tunnels through the granite took 3 times longer than projected and killed men by the hundred. Stanford was in Sacramento handling politics. Crocker was in the mountains watching the numbers. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, the Central Pacific met the Union Pacific, and the continent was connected. Stanford drove the ceremonial golden spike. He swung the hammer and missed the spike entirely. The telegraph operator sent the completion signal anyway. The country celebrated. The missed swing was not widely reported. By then, the Big Four had made fortunes that had no precedent in California. The land grants alone, 9 million acres at fire sale prices or free, were worth more than any of them had earned in all their previous careers combined. The bonds. The construction contracts routed through companies they privately controlled. The monopoly on California rail that came after. Stanford bought a farm near the Santa Clara Valley, 650 acres outside a small settlement. He named the farm after a single coastal redwood tree that stood on the property. The tree was tall, nearly 110 feet, and had been a landmark for anyone traveling the El Camino Real. The locals called it El Palo Alto, the tall tree. He was building an empire. The farm was where he went to think about what came next. What he didn't have yet was an heir who could hold any of it. Leland DeWitt Stanford Jr. was born on May 14, 1868, 1 year before his father drove that golden spike into Utah ground. He was the only child who survived. Jane had suffered through multiple miscarriages before him, and after him there were no more children. He was the only one. Both parents poured themselves into him in the way that parents do when they have almost lost the possibility entirely. Jane structured her days around his education and health. Leland Sr., who was managing a railroad empire and a political career, made time, documented time, deliberate time, to be present with the boy. Leland Jr. was not a typical child in any dimension. By the time he was 12, he had filled an entire room in the Sacramento mansion with a collection of artifacts that would have been impressive for a professional archaeologist. Coins, Greek, Roman, American, medieval European, Native American objects gathered from across California, Egyptian antiquities that his parents helped him acquire through dealers and on travels. He cataloged everything. He wrote to adults in the field, actual working archaeologists and museum curators, asking specific questions about provenance and dating. The letters he received back were not the letters adults write to children. They were collegial. The people on the other end thought they were corresponding with a peer. He was 15. In the spring of 1883, the Stanfords took him to Europe. This was not unusual for families of their means. The grand tour, the cultural exposure, the museums. But Leland Jr. had been planning this trip the way other boys planned summer games. He knew which collections he wanted to see. He had a list. They traveled through England, France, Germany, Greece, Egypt. He added to his collection at every stop. He was in serious correspondence with the director of the Agamemnon excavations. He was talking to his father about starting a museum in California to house everything he'd gathered. By early 1884, they were in Florence, Italy, in February and March. Cold, beautiful, full of the things he had been studying from Sacramento for years. In Florence, in March 1884, he developed typhoid fever. Typhoid in 1884 was not the same sentence for everyone who caught it. Some recovered, many did not. The disease moved fast once it took hold. High fever, delirium, organ failure. The Stanfords had the best physicians available in Florence. It made no difference. Leland Stanford Jr. died on March 13, 1884, in a hotel room in Florence. He was 15 years old. His collection, the coins, the artifacts, the Egyptian pieces, the catalogued objects from a boy who wrote letters to archaeologists, was waiting for him in Sacramento. Leland Sr. was said to have told Jane in the days that followed, "The children of California shall be our children." Jane had a photograph of him. In the weeks before he died, before any of them knew yet what was coming, she had arranged for a portrait. He was well then, or well enough. He was 15, serious-faced, the kind of boy who looked older than he was because he was thinking about things that made you look older. She didn't know it was the last one. She kept it with her for the rest of her life. They went home without their son. They went home with a plan that had no language yet, only a weight where a child used to be, and $40 million, and the farm by the tall redwood tree that Leland Jr. had visited once briefly when he was small. In the summer of 1884, Leland Stanford Sr. sat across a desk from Charles William Eliot, the president of Harvard University, and asked him a question. Eliot was 50 years old, thin-faced, with a birthmark that covered the right side of his face from cheekbone to jaw. A detail he had learned to ignore because ignoring it was the only option available to a man who wanted to run anything. He had been building Harvard's endowment for 15 years. He understood, better than almost anyone in American education, what money could actually do inside an institution. Stanford asked him, what would it cost to build a great university? Eliot's answer, reportedly, was $2.5 million. That would do it. That would build something fine. Stanford said he thought he could do a little more than that. This was 1884. His son had been dead for less than 6 months. The grief was still raw enough that people in the room reportedly watched him while he spoke, the way people watch someone who might break without warning. He did not break. He sat very still and talked about buildings and endowments and what kind of student he wanted to educate. He visited Cornell. He visited MIT. He talked to Daniel Coit Gilman, who had built Johns Hopkins from nothing a decade earlier, and understood the architecture of an institution the way Stanford understood the architecture of a railroad. Each conversation gave him a different number, a different model, a different idea about what was possible. He came home and chose the farm, the Palo Alto Farm, 650 acres along the Santa Clara Valley, named for the tall redwood on the property, was where his son had visited as a small child, not where the boy had lived, not where he had studied, not where anything significant in his short life had happened, just a place he had passed through briefly, once, years before he died. That was the point. Stanford wasn't building a monument where the boy had been. He was building the future where the boy should have gone. On November 11th, 1885, Leland and Jane Stanford signed the founding grant for Leland Stanford Jr. University. The grant committed more than 8,000 acres and $20 million in assets to the university's endowment. It named the institution specifically as a memorial to their son. The language was explicit. This was not a civic project or a philanthropic gesture. It was a monument with classrooms. The university was to be free, no tuition. Stanford's reasoning was direct. He had watched the gold rush teach him that most people couldn't reach the opportunity in front of them because the cost of getting there was too high. He didn't want money to be the reason someone couldn't attend. His university was going to reach the students that Harvard wasn't looking for. Jane oversaw the physical design herself. The architects, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, who had worked with Henry Hobson Richardson, proposed the sandstone Romanesque style, the covered arcades, the red tile roofs. Jane pushed towards something warmer, more Mediterranean, with courtyards open to the California light. People who knew her said she wanted it to feel like Florence, like the city where she had last seen her son alive, walking through stone corridors in the winter light. Construction began in 1887. The main quadrangle alone cost more than Harvard's entire endowment had been when Eliot told Stanford what a great university would cost. The university opened on October 1st, 1891. 559 students enrolled in the first class. No tuition bill. No debt to start their lives with. The boy the campus was built to honor had been dead for 7 years. Leland Sr. attended the opening. He was 67 years old, and he did not look well. He had exactly 2 years left. Leland Stanford Sr. died at the Palo Alto farm on June 21st, 1893. Heart failure. He was 69 years old. The farm was quiet when it happened. The university was a mile away, operating its second full academic year, full of students who had never paid $1 to be there. He left behind an estate that was technically enormous and practically insoluble. The railroad assets, the Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the ancillary land holdings and bond portfolios were tangled in corporate structures that took lawyers months to map. His personal fortune was inseparable from the railroad company's finances in ways that the courts had not yet been asked to untangle. And the federal government, which had spent 30 years watching the railroad barons collect on the land grant deal, had decided it was time to collect something back. The claim? The Central Pacific Railroad owed the United States government approximately $15 million in outstanding loans. These were the construction bonds, the money the government had fronted per mile of track in the 1860s, which had never been fully repaid. The railroad had been profitable for 2 decades. The government wanted its share. Their legal theory was aggressive. Jane Stanford, as primary heir to the estate, was personally responsible for the debt, not the railroad corporation. Jane, the widow, the woman who had just buried her husband 400 miles from where her son had died 9 years earlier. Federal attorneys moved to freeze the Stanford estate while litigation proceeded. Jane's personal bank accounts were locked. The university's operating funds, which came from the estate, were frozen alongside them. The institution that Leland had endowed with $20 million in assets was suddenly running on approximately $10 a day. That is not a misprint. $10. For a university with hundreds of students, dozens of faculty, and a physical campus that required staff to maintain, faculty paychecks stopped. Jane Stanford called a meeting. She told the faculty she would not close the university. She told them she would find a way to pay them. Then she went home and opened her jewelry boxes. She sold pieces, brooches, necklaces, earrings that Leland had given her across 40 years of marriage to make payroll. Not as a symbolic gesture, because it was the actual mechanism available to her. The federal government had taken everything else. Picture that. A 60-year-old woman sitting at a dressing table in a house full of legal notices, holding a pair of earrings up to the light, calculating whether they're worth enough to cover this week's salaries. That is what the betrayal loop looked like from the inside. The legal case dragged through the federal courts for 6 years. David Terry had represented Stanford interests in California courts before his own violent death in 1889, so Jane assembled new counsel and kept fighting. She refused every settlement offer that would have required the university to close or surrender assets. In 1899, the Supreme Court ruled in her favor. The debt was the railroad corporation's liability, not the widow's personal obligation. The estate was unfrozen. The university was safe. Jane had spent 6 years paying professors out of her personal wealth, while the federal government argued that the fortune her husband built on federal land grants was still, somehow, the government's to take back. She won. The university survived. And Jane Stanford, at 66 years old, was now running it alone. The university had a president. His name was David Starr Jordan, a tall, square-jawed ichthyologist from upstate New York who had cataloged more species of fish than almost anyone alive, and who had a gift for administrative confidence that could be difficult to distinguish from certainty. He had come from Indiana University in 1891 to run Stanford, and he was, by most accounts, effective at the external face of the job: fundraising, faculty recruitment, the public presentation of a new institution trying to establish credibility. Jane ran everything else. She was involved in faculty hiring decisions, in curriculum choices, in what the university's public statement said and didn't say. Jordan was the name on the letterhead. Jane was the name on the founding grant, and she had not forgotten what the university was for. The arrangement held for nearly a decade. Then, in 1900, it cracked. Edward Allsworth Ross was an economics professor, 33 years old, popular with students, with the kind of lecturing energy that fills a room and the political convictions that make a university famous or embarrassed, depending on who's in charge. He gave a public speech in San Francisco that year, arguing for restrictions on Chinese immigration and attacking the use of Asian labor to undercut American workers' wages. Ross had 15 years of a career in front of him. He had no idea what he'd just stepped on. Jane Stanford read the newspaper accounts of the speech she wrote to Jordan. Her letter, which Jordan kept, and which survived, said Ross had no place at her university. The precise wording varied across accounts, but the substance was consistent. A man using Stanford's podium to advocate for policies that targeted the same Chinese workers who had built her family's railroad was not going to continue doing so with her name on the building. Jordan fired Ross in November 1900. 7 faculty members resigned in protest within weeks. Among them was sociologist Amos Griswold Warner, and the resignations attracted national coverage. The American Association of University Professors, still being formed as a concept, pointed to the Ross case as the founding argument for faculty protections from donor interference. The press framing was consistent: wealthy widow silences professor. Freedom of thought strangled by railroad money. What the press did not examine: Ross had been using a memorial to a dead child. A university founded specifically to serve the children of working California, to argue that workers of a particular ethnicity should be excluded from the economy. Jane Stanford had personally watched the federal government try to strip that university for 6 years, while Ross had been a protected employee inside it. Her tolerance for ideological provocation was, by that point, exactly 0. She wrote in a private letter, again preserved, that Stanford was not a political instrument. She meant it as a boundary, not a policy statement. The distinction was lost in translation. The academic freedom controversy attached itself to Stanford's reputation and did not let go for years. Jordan managed the fallout publicly, maintaining the position that the firing had been his decision, protecting Jane's name from the worst of the press. What Jordan got in return for that protection was something he would spend years making sure Jane never took back: Jane Stanford kept the photograph in a frame. It traveled with her. The exact movements of that image across 2 decades, from Florence to Sacramento to the Stanford Mansion in San Francisco's Nob Hill neighborhood, and eventually to Hawaii, are not all documented in ways that allow certainty. What is documented is what she did with it. She kept it present. Not in storage, not in an album. Present. The founding grant for the university said, in its opening language, that the institution was to stand in memory and honor of Leland Stanford Jr. Not as a metaphor, as a legal and institutional commitment. Jane made sure the name never changed, the mission statement never softened, the memorial dimension never got buried under the practical business of running a university. She pushed for a museum. The Leland Stanford Jr. Museum, on the campus's outer quad, was designed to house her son's artifact collection, the coins he had cataloged, the Egyptian pieces, the Native American objects from California that he had gathered as a boy in Sacramento. The collection traveled from the Sacramento mansion to the campus under her supervision. The museum opened in 1891, the same year as the university itself. Its founding collection was the obsessions of a 15-year-old who had never seen the building. By the time Jane was managing the institution alone, through the legal battle, through the Ross firing, through the years of running a university on her own with Jordan nominally in charge, the museum was her most direct point of contact with why any of it existed. She walked through it. Regularly. A woman in her 60s moving past display cases of Egyptian coins gathered by a child who had been dead for 15 years. She added to the collection herself when she could. She funded acquisitions, traveled with buying intentions, kept the collection alive as a living thing rather than a sealed memorial. By 1904, Jane was 75 years old and had been running some version of this institution, fighting for it, protecting it, paying for it, for 20 years. She had sold jewelry to keep it open. She had won a Supreme Court case to keep it solvent. She had fired a professor and absorbed a national controversy to keep its founding purpose clear. And she was tired in ways that showed. She had begun, in the last year of her life, to draft changes to the university's governance documents. The changes would have shifted certain administrative authorities, the kind that Jordan had accumulated over his 13 years as president, back toward the board of trustees, back toward oversight, away from Jordan. She had also written letters to at least one trustee expressing concerns about the university's direction under Jordan's leadership. The concerns were not dramatic. They were the concerns of a founder watching an institution develop its own institutional personality and finding that personality not quite what she had intended. Jordan knew about the letters. He knew about the governance draft. And in January 1905, Jane Stanford boarded a ship for Hawaii. The photograph came with her. She arrived in Honolulu in January 1905 with her secretary, Bertha Berner, and the expectation of arrest. Berner had worked for Jane for years. She was meticulous, loyal in her presentation, and so thoroughly embedded in the Stanford household that she knew Jane's daily habits better than most family members would. She knew what Jane drank when she drank it, which mineral water she preferred, how she took her evening dose of bicarbonate of soda. On the evening of January 14, 1905, Jane Stanford drank a glass of Poland Spring mineral water in her room at the Moana Hotel. Within minutes, her body went rigid, convulsions, severe spasms that left her gripping the edge of the furniture and unable to speak clearly. The hotel doctor was called. He examined her, noted the symptom pattern, the convulsive rigidity, the difficulty breathing, the progressive muscle lock, and said what the symptoms pointed to: strychnine. The mineral water bottle was tested. Strychnine was found in it. The Honolulu police were notified. A report was filed. And then, Because Jane Stanford recovered over the next several hours as the dose worked through her system, the urgency dissipated. She recovered. She stayed in Hawaii. She told people she felt better, that perhaps it had been something else, that she didn't want the incident to become a public matter. She did not go home. 6 weeks later, on the night of February 28, 1905, Jane Stanford died in her room at the Moana Hotel. Bertha Berner was present. The attending physician, Dr. Francis Howard Humphreys, was called to the room and found Jane Stanford in the final stages of what he recorded as strychnine poisoning. The muscle convulsions, the locked jaw, the arched back, he wrote it down. Strychnine poisoning. The cause of death was not ambiguous to him. Within 48 hours, David Starr Jordan was on a ship to Honolulu. Jordan was president of a university whose primary patron and founder had just been poisoned to death in a Hawaiian hotel room. A murder investigation of that nature, attached to Stanford University, attached to its endowment and its donor relationships and its still fragile 20-year institutional reputation, would have been catastrophic. New universities did not survive that kind of association. Donations would stop. Enrollment would collapse. The Board of Trustees, already navigating Jane's unfinished governance changes, would face a crisis with no playbook. Jordan brought his own physician, a man named Waterhouse. Waterhouse examined the same body, reviewed the same symptoms, and reached a different conclusion: heart failure. The Honolulu police closed the case. The first poisoning attempt, the mineral water in January, the strychnine test, the filed police report, was not mentioned in Jordan's public statements, not in his letters to the faculty, not in his eulogy, which described a woman who had given her life to an institution and died peacefully at the end of it. 2 doctors, 2 conclusions. One of them had been hired by the man with the most to lose. The case file went into storage in Honolulu. Nobody looked at it seriously for nearly a century. What Jordan stood to lose, if the investigation continued, and what Jane had been about to do to his authority, would not be fully understood until a historian opened that file in the early 2000s and started reading. The case file from Honolulu sat untouched for nearly a century. In 2003, a Stanford-trained physician named Robert Cutler published a book arguing that Jane Stanford had been murdered, and that David Starr Jordan had known it, covered it, and walked away clean. Cutler had spent years pulling together the original Honolulu police reports, the toxicology findings, the physician's statements, and Jordan's own correspondence from the days after Jane's death. What he found was not ambiguous, not to him. Dr. Humphreys, the Honolulu physician who had examined Jane Stanford on the night of February 28th, had written his conclusion in plain medical language: strychnine poisoning. He had seen the symptoms. He had measured the progression. He knew what strychnine did to a body: the progressive muscle rigidity, the arched spine, the locked jaw, the convulsions arriving in waves, and he had documented it. Then Jordan arrived from San Francisco. Jordan brought with him Dr. Ernest Waterhouse, a Honolulu physician he had engaged on arrival. Waterhouse examined the same body Humphreys had examined. He reviewed the same symptoms. He reached a different conclusion: natural causes, heart failure. 2 physicians, same room, same body, opposite answers. The mechanism here was not complicated. A university president arrives at a scene of suspected murder. He controls access. He controls who speaks to the press. He controls what the official institutional statement says. Jordan did all 3. His public statement, released before any formal investigation had concluded, described Jane Stanford's death as peaceful and natural. Humphreys, who had been the first physician on the scene and had committed his strychnine finding to paper, found himself under significant social and professional pressure to soften his account. He did not fully recant, but his public statements after Jordan's arrival were notably less certain than his initial written record. The strychnine bottle, found in Jane's hotel room, logged in the initial police inventory, subsequently disappeared from the evidence record. Cutler documented the gap between the inventory log and what actually made it to any formal proceeding. Jordan delivered the eulogy for Jane Stanford in San Francisco. He described her as a woman who had given everything to an institution she loved, who had died peacefully, who deserved the community's gratitude and grief. He did not mention that she had nearly died of strychnine poisoning 6 weeks earlier in the same city. He did not mention the police report. He did not mention Humphreys. The Honolulu case file was closed. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. Jordan remained president of Stanford University until 1916, 11 more years. He raised the endowment, expanded the faculty, built the institution's national reputation. The university Jane had fought for through frozen bank accounts and borrowed jewelry, and a 6-year federal lawsuit became, under Jordan's continued stewardship, one of the most respected research universities in the country. He never spoke publicly about the strychnine, not once. The question the case file could not answer was the one that mattered most. Who? Pick up a bottle of mineral water. Hold it. Someone opened one exactly like it, introduced a precise quantity of strychnine, enough to kill but not so much it would be immediately detectable in a casual examination, and put it back where Jane Stanford would reach for it. That is not a crime of opportunity. That is a crime of access and planning. 2 people had that access, consistently, at both poisoning attempts, January and February. Bertha Berner had been Jane's personal secretary for years. She traveled with Jane, managed Jane's daily schedule, handled her correspondence, knew her habits down to which water she drank and at what hour. She was present in the room, or in immediate proximity, when Jane became ill in January. She was present in the hotel in February. Berner's accounts of both evenings were inconsistent in ways that investigators at the time noted and then declined to pursue. Her description of where she had been, what she had done, when she had first noticed Jane's distress, the timeline shifted between the initial police statement and subsequent interviews. She later wrote a memoir about her years with Jane Stanford. In it, she described Jane as demanding, difficult, and increasingly erratic in her final years. The portrait was not flattering. A secretary writing an unflattering memoir about a dead employer is not evidence of murder. But the timing and content of Berner's public account, published after Jordan had already established the heart failure narrative, fit neatly into a story that had already been decided. Jordan's motive was structural and specific. Jane had been drafting governance changes that would have moved authority over key university decisions, faculty appointments, budget allocations, the president's operational independence, back toward the board of trustees and away from Jordan. She had been doing this quietly, through her personal attorney, without alerting Jordan directly. But Jordan knew. In the weeks before her Hawaii trip, he had written to at least one trustee expressing concern about Jane's intentions. He had run the university for 13 years. He had protected her name during the Ross firing controversy, absorbing public criticism that could have been directed at her. He had managed the institution through the aftermath of the federal lawsuit. He had, in his own accounting, built the thing that Stanford's money had merely funded. And now she was going to clip his authority, formally, on paper, legally. She was 75 years old and drafting legal documents in hotel rooms in Honolulu. She was not going to stop. Cutler's conclusion, laid out across 300 pages of reconstructed evidence, was that Jordan orchestrated the suppression of the poisoning verdict and that the most likely source of the strychnine was someone within Jane's immediate household. He stopped short of a direct accusation by name, as the legal record required. The weight of the accumulated facts, he argued, pointed clearly enough. The official cause of death remains heart failure. No one was ever charged. Jordan's motive, Berner's access, Humphreys's suppressed finding, the disappeared bottle, the closed case. The WHO remains disputed? That is the accurate thing to say. But the motive does not require a conviction to be understood. Jane Stanford was about to restructure the governance of an institution that David Starr Jordan had spent 13 years making his own. She died before she could do it. He continued as president for 11 more years. The university he protected went on to become exactly what Jane Stanford had built it to be. That is the final irony. Not his university, hers. The name on every diploma, every building, every degree conferred, since 1891 is not Jordan's. It is Leland Stanford Jr.'s. On April 18, 1906, 14 months after Jane Stanford died in Honolulu, the ground beneath the Stanford campus moved. The San Francisco earthquake, magnitude 7.9, hit at 5:12 in the morning. The campus was 15 miles from the city. The shaking lasted nearly a minute. When it stopped, the main quadrangle was largely intact, but the Leland Stanford Jr. Museum, the building Jane had personally overseen, the home of her son's artifact collection, had lost its front facade. Large sections of the collection were destroyed or damaged under falling masonry. The museum would not be fully rebuilt in anything like its original form for decades. The estimated cost to the university, $3 million in structural damage, more than the entire operating budget for the years Jane had run it on jewelry money. The university rebuilt, not completely and not fast, but it rebuilt. Tuition remained free until 1920. For 29 years after Leland Stanford signed the founding grant, a student could attend one of the most ambitious new universities in the country without paying $1 in fees. The idea that cost was a barrier. The same idea Stanford had absorbed watching minors pay whatever a Sacramento grocery store charged because they had no choice, became the policy that shaped the institution's early identity. In 1920, the board introduced tuition. The reasoning was financial. The endowment, even after Jane's years of protection and Jordan's fundraising, was not sufficient to sustain operations at scale without student revenue. The free university lasted exactly as long as the founders' original financial commitment could hold it. But here is what it built in the meantime. The first class of 559 students in 1891 included people who went on to careers in law, medicine, engineering, and public service, who could not have attended Harvard or Yale or any Eastern institution without significant financial resources they didn't have. The university drew from California, from the West, from families that the older institutions were not designed to reach. Frederick Terman, who taught electrical engineering at Stanford starting in the 1920s, would go on to mentor two graduate students, William Hewlett and David Packard, in a way that seeded the entire technology corridor that became Silicon Valley. Hewlett and Packard incorporated in 1939. The garage where they built their first product was in Palo Alto, the city named for the redwood tree that Leland Stanford had named his farm after in the 1870s. The grief that built a university built the neighborhood that built the internet. That is not a metaphor. That is a sequence of documented decisions, investments, and institutional choices that ran in a straight line from a hotel room in Florence in 1884 to a garage in Palo Alto in 1939. The photograph was still in Jane's personal effects when they were transferred to the university after her death, cataloged, stored, preserved. The last image of a boy who collected coins and wrote letters to archaeologists and died at 15 without ever sitting in a lecture hall. The museum built to house his collection. Damaged in 1906, partially rebuilt, eventually reconstituted as the Cantor Art Center in 1999, still holds portions of what he gathered: Egyptian pieces, coins. The obsessions of a child who had 3 years, maybe 4, before the typhoid took him, to build something that would outlast him by a century and a half. 559 students in 1891, 17,000 today. Every one of them walking through a monument to a boy who never walked through it himself. The boy never went to college. The university he inspired graduated the people who built the world he never got to see. The redwood tree is still there. El Palo Alto, the tall tree that gave the city its name, the landmark Leland Stanford pointed to when he decided where to build his farm, stands at the edge of Palo Alto today. Fenced, protected, 110 feet of living wood that has been there since before the railroad existed. Students drive past it on Alma Street without looking up. Most of them don't know it was there before the university was. Stanford University in 2024 covers land in every direction from that tree. 83 Nobel laureates have been affiliated with the institution. The endowment, the money that Jane fought a 6-year federal lawsuit to protect, the money she paid into with her own jewelry, has compounded across a century into the largest university endowment in the United States. The machine that grief built is now one of the most powerful financial and intellectual institutions on Earth. The original farm structures still stand at the property's edge, not as museums, as working buildings. The winery, the barn, the outbuildings of what was once a working agricultural operation. Leland Stanford had bred racehorses on this land. He had studied the mechanics of a horse's gait by commissioning Edward Muybridge, the photographer who would go on to invent the foundational principles of motion pictures, to set up 24 cameras along a track and capture each frame of a horse in full gallop. That sequence of images, taken on Stanford's farm in the 1870s, became one of the founding documents of cinema. A boy died in Florence. His parents built a university. A photographer on their farm invented the moving image. The university's graduates built the internet. The Cantor Art Center, reconstituted from the original Leland Stanford Jr. Museum after the 1906 earthquake, still holds portions of the collection: Egyptian pieces, coins, objects gathered by a child who had run out of time. The memorial became an institution. The institution became a city. Both of those facts started with a 15-year-old running out of time in a hotel room in Italy. The photograph is in the Stanford University collections. It traveled from Florence to Sacramento to San Francisco to Honolulu, in a frame, in a trunk, in Jane Stanford's hands across 21 years of widowhood, and legal battles, and faculty firings and poisoned water. After her death in 1905, it was cataloged with her personal effects and transferred to the university. It has been there since. The boy in the photograph never saw the campus, never walked the sandstone arcade, never sat in a lecture hall, or handed in an assignment, or graduated from anything. He was 15. He collected coins and wrote letters to archaeologists and died before he got to do what his parents built 8,000 acres of California to allow other people to do. His parents spent the equivalent, in 2024 dollars, of somewhere between $600 million and $1 billion building it. Not to honor a legacy, to fill a specific shape of absence. Jane Stanford walked through that campus for 12 years after her husband died, managing a legal case and a faculty rebellion and a national academic freedom controversy, carrying a photograph of a boy who had never been there, and making decisions about the institution as though he were watching every one of them. She was murdered, probably. The official record says otherwise. The evidence that survived says she was, and the man best positioned to stop the investigation had the clearest reason not to. David Starr Jordan's name is not on a building at Stanford. Jane Stanford's name is not on a building either. The university is named for the boy in the photograph. The sandstone arches catch the California light the same way they did in 1891. The red tile roofs hold the same color Jane chose because she wanted it to feel like the city where she last saw her son alive. 50,000 people walk the campus each year, students, faculty, tourists, past the museum that holds his coins, past the tree that gave the city its name, past the place where a woman sat at a dressing table and held earrings up to the light to calculate whether they were worth enough to make this week's payroll. Not a grave, a university. Both things are true. The university outlived the grief. The grief built the university. If you've walked that campus and felt the weight of it without knowing why, I want to hear about it in the comments. Sources and further reading in the description.